Welcome back to Return to More. I'm your host, Jonathan Moore. Today's episode is entitled Workplace Chronicles, Navigating Difficult Colleagues. I don't know about you, but for many of us who spend most of our time or even too much of our time at work, we find ourselves interacting with different personalities. And also, for those of you similar to me who might consider themselves perfectionists, or even hold themselves to a high standard of excellence, it can often be difficult to move work forward, especially when you have to rely on the contribution of other people. So what does it look like when everyone's not so nice, or everyone doesn't ascribe to the same level of professional ethos that you do, or, God forbid, everyone doesn't have the same level of acumen that you do? I am so happy to have our guest for today, who's also a good friend of mine, Jessica Todman, who's the Executive Vice President and COO of the National Association of Higher Education Systems. Jessica and I have worked together for a number of years, but in addition to that, she brings a wealth of experience working at some of the highest levels, not only in government, but also in higher education. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about ways in which we can actually navigate difficult colleagues, maintain our professionalism, keep our jobs, and still move work forward. But before we invite Jessica in, I want to share an anecdote with you about how I came to encounter or navigate difficult colleagues. There was a context that I worked in where two of my direct reports had actually applied for my job. Now, of course, I didn't know that till much later into my tenure at this organization. But as you can imagine, the two colleagues who were now my subordinates who applied for my job and didn't get it weren't necessarily too thrilled when I joined the organization, especially as the leader of their team. And so they did everything they could to show just how much that I was not welcomed, or that they did not care to have me as the leader of the team. You know, that experience was actually the first one where I learned the differences between types of leadership. So you may have heard of the term de facto leadership, right? So it's the idea that there is a leader who may not necessarily carry the title and the authority that comes with the title, but they have influence to compel people to action, whether based on proximity or just shifts in informal power dynamics. And so while I was the titular leader of the team, I certainly was combating de facto leaders of the team. And what made this experience also unique, as well as challenging, is that this team was very strong. They had such a high acumen. They did take pride in what they did, and they did it well. And so their calculus then became, well, if we continue to do our job and we do it well, nearly to perfection, then that's the least likelihood, that Jonathan will have to intervene or Jonathan will have to engage with us. Now, as a manager, you think, that's great. No sweat off my back. Work's going to get done. It's going to move forward, and it's going to be nearly flawless. But as a leader, it became difficult for me to do a few things. One, make connections across work. Two, actually process the work and the ways in which it was happening. And then three, actually demonstrate competence around the work that was happening within my portfolio of supervision. So there became this tension. I had a really smart, capable team who did work, and imagine that pressure, to perfection because they didn't want me to have to intervene or engage. Then I also found myself as a leader feeling unprepared at times, feeling as if I lacked an overall awareness of what was transpiring. So for about 2.5, 3 years, went through different phases with this team. We tried leadership coaching. I brought in an external consultant. We had some come to Jesus conversations with individuals, if you will. And nevertheless, the dynamic only slightly shifted when one of the de facto leaders transitioned away from the organization. And so I say all of that to say that as I look back on that experience, there are a number of things that I would have done differently in terms of using my voice to effectuate change. But there's very few that I would change because it taught me valuable lessons about how do you navigate difficult colleagues in a work environment in a way that maintains professionalism, allows you to keep your job, and then 3, advances work. And so, to that end, I'm so pleased to welcome our guest. Jessica, welcome to Return to More.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm happy to have you. I'm thrilled for our conversation today. Before we get into the topic at hand, because this is my first season of Return to More, and I think you know me well enough by now, and because we have worked together before, I want to know, what is your earliest memory of me and us?
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. So when we worked together, I was making a physical move in my career. And so I actually had a weird scenario where before ever showing up in our shared office, I met you at a retreat. So the team was on a retreat for leadership with some other peer groups that had roles like ours. And I got to meet you there. And it's a really interesting way to see how a leadership team functions. And I think taking people out of the office and putting them into something that's inherently uncomfortable as a retreat where like not everyone thinks that's a fun thing to do with work colleagues was a really interesting way to get to know people and as work professionals before I knew anything about how they do their work, right? Because so much of what you do in a leadership retreat is conceptual. So I don't remember a specific first conversation. I remember us getting along quickly. I remember you being very welcoming, being very intentional about orienting me and helping me understand the challenges that you saw that I might be able to help with. So all of my memories of you are just really positive of the way you clearly wanted me to succeed. And
Oh
I
my
really appreciated that.
gosh. Well, thank you. I was not expecting all of that. You're going to make me blush, make me tear up, all the things. I will say, because I'm the host and I can take privilege before we get into the conversation, for whoever's listening, um, typically, and this is not to toot my own horn, but in many contexts I've been in, and I've told Jessica this, obviously, but many contexts I've been in, I've always found myself to be what I would consider the standard bearer of excellence, of professionalism, um, of just all things good. And when I met Jessica, it was probably the first time I will say that I encountered such a consummate professional who caused me to actually want to elevate my practice as a professional. Just her attention to detail, the way in which she thinks about things, and both big and small, but just her pleasant personality. And what I really appreciate about Jessica is she is a New Yorker in many sense of the word, but you never have to guess how she's feeling or thinking. She's honest, she's direct, but she does so with grace and with poise. And so I certainly benefited from working with Jessica, which is why I'm excited to share her voice with those of you who might be listening. Okay, enough of that. So, Jessica, navigating difficult colleagues in the workplace. When you hear the word or words difficult colleagues, what comes to mind? What comes up for you?
The actual first thing that comes to mind is something that my husband tells our kids. I have three awesome stepkids. They're currently 22, 24, and 26. And excuse the language, but he says that everybody is somebody's asshole, right? You have like your story. I think in every workplace, there's like a person who becomes your stories, or this is the way this person aggravated me today, distracted me today, did not come to play as a team today. And they become like a larger than life person to all of the people in your home life who support you and have to listen to your boring stories and all those things. And so when you ask me about working with difficult people, I come to that conversation with the confidence that I am someone's difficult person.
Ooh.
Um, it's not my intention. That's not how I try to show up at work, but to be 15 whatever years into my career and think that no one ever had me on their I go home from work and I don't like this person or how they spoke to me today list would be very naive. And I wouldn't take pride in it, and I would want that person to tell me. But I think there's this realization that the ways we show up in work are very different based on our experiences, based on our background, based on how we were trained by our former colleagues and bosses to behave about what was appropriate and acceptable in a former work environment, which may not translate to your current work environment. And so that's what it makes me think of. It's like everybody has their work nemesis, their difficult person. And at some point, it's probably been you, even if just for a day or a meeting, it's been you.
Yeah. So fascinating because even though I try to be introspective, I never want to think that I'm someone's asshole. But the
Yep.
reality is that you're right. You're 100% right. And this wasn't where I planned to start the conversation, but since you brought it up, the idea of introspections, right? So if we're talking about
Hmm.
difficult colleagues, that's what Return to More is about, looking inward first. So let's actually start there. What are some ways in which you either came to that realization, or how could people come to the realization? Or let me ask it better, or let me rephrase. Is there sort of a contemplation protocol or thought process that a person could follow to start to be introspective about the degree to which they're difficult, or the difficult colleague, or the difficult leader?
Yeah, it's an interesting moment you've caught me at because since we work together, I'm now in a doctoral program in higher education management at the University of Pennsylvania. And so we're taking a class on leading change, and a series of the readings were focused on the human element of change and all the things people bring to the workplace that make it hard for them to show up with their full self or fully participate in transformative work and all of those things. Part of one of the interesting literature pieces that we read, the authors are Keegan and Leahy, and it's called The Real Reason People Won't Change. And it
Mm.
has this concept that underneath someone's resistance to change, that there is what you would call a competing commitment, right? So you're asking them to do something faster, and they somehow inside of them have a tacit, deeply held commitment to I care about details, and I'm always going to take 3 days to do something because I want to revisit it and give myself a break from it, right? So they have this strong view of themselves as someone who's thorough, and you've asked them, in their opinion, to be less thorough. And so when they're resisting you, it's not because they're resisting you or they're resisting the thing. They might just be having pride or experiences that make them feel like they want to conduct work in a different way. And so it creates this friction. And the reason this gets to your question is because that person probably can't articulate that. Right. So you're, as the leader, being fed this literature that says you're going to talk to that person and you're going to understand them and you're going to help present the changes and bring them along in the change in a way that addresses their core competing commitments about themselves and their professionalism. And that requires people to be able to articulate them. And
Mm.
I think what's at the root of your question is that we're not very introspective. But I think one of the cues that always prompts me to start looking inward is when I have multiple similarly challenging run-ins with the same person or the same thing. And you always say, what's the common denominator here? And is it me? Is it the way I'm showing up? Is it the way I'm asking questions? Is it the assumptions I'm bringing to the conversation that is causing this to go sideways or somehow differently than I expected? Because I think a lot of workplace difficulty is unanticipated
Hmm.
until someone earns that distinction in your mind of being a difficult person, and then you like plant the difficulty for yourself because you're like, oh, I have to go talk to Josie again, and
Yeah.
that's going to be real difficult because
Yes.
Josie always gives me a hard time. You don't know if that could be everything you've spoken to Josie about makes her upset. It doesn't mean that if she's responding to you or to work or to anything like that. So I think
That's
the
so true.
introspection is interesting because a lot of people don't do it.
Yeah.
Leaders are encouraged to do it. They
Yeah.
don't often have time.
Right.
And for leaders to do it well, they would need everyone around them to also have that privilege and opportunity. And let's not forget that having time to be introspective and unpack what happened today at work and think deeply about it is a
Yeah.
privilege,
No, you're
right? Some
absolutely
people, they walk into their home and they have 1 to 5 children excited to see them. They have a parent or a sibling or someone who's expecting their attention, and they don't get to sit down and be like, what could I have done better at work today?
Yeah.
And even just that kind of simple introspection, I think, can be really challenging for people to make space for. And it's
And so-
uncomfortable. So making space for something uncomfortable is also just not something you're going to prioritize.
which is true. And it gets to the heart. Neither one of us are psychologists, but I often think we both are relatively skilled in interpersonal awareness, right? The ability for us to not only tap into, as you mentioned, introspectively what's happening with us and how we're feeling, but also the idea of being able, or the concept of being able to at least identify, how another person may be feeling based on their response. You kind of articulated that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about your understanding of interpersonal awareness and the degree to which that plays a part in one managing as a leader? And then I think we'll pivot shortly into like everyone else. But
Yeah, I think a lot of my awareness comes from observing other people. You mentioned and complimented my forthrightness, my directness. It is not always well received. I do try to do it with grace. It's not
you do.
always guaranteed. But I would say that there's a strand of that that comes out very quickly in my work with people is that they don't always know what to expect with me, but they know I'm not going to lie to them. I'm not going to mislead. I'm not going to pretend to be enjoying something I don't enjoy, right?
Absolutely.
I will still do it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
if I have concerns about something we're doing, I'll express them one on one with the person who needs to hear them respectfully.
Yep.
But sometimes to help someone overcome their friction, you need to describe your own and say, actually, I was challenged by this assignment too. I wasn't sure why we were doing this. I'm
Mhm.
not sure that I believe in this. And that's not a tool you can use all the time, and you can't use
Right.
it with a mixed audience.
Right.
But sometimes one on one, you can just be vulnerable
Yeah.
and
Vulnerability.
say, this doesn't feel like what I wanted to do today, right? It doesn't even have to be about the task. You can
Yeah.
just draw things out of people by saying, like, this has been a really exhausting month, and this is just another thing on top of another thing, right? And being honest about how you're experiencing work can sometimes go a long way. I think I also have this introspection thing I loved, and I forget who the author was, but someone said, influence is what you think you have until you try to use it.
Mm.
And I think that's so interesting. And it gets to your idea that you started with of de facto leadership, right? You think because someone named you executive deputy boss of the Superdome that you are in charge, and you show up and you find out who's really in charge. And in a
Yes.
school building, we know often it's the principal's admin assistant who's really in charge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you find out who's really in charge. And that to me is the heart of, you think you have influence because someone gave you a title. And then you try to use that title and only that title to leverage a change or workflow that you'd like to see. And people say, who are you and why should I listen to you?
Mhm.
Because your sheriff's badge doesn't mean anything to them. And so it's inherently, there's all these personal dynamics that come in to any workplace environment that you can't always anticipate and can take a while to assess and examine and make sense of so that you can navigate it properly.
Yeah, I mean, you just named so much, just vulnerability, right? When we talk not only about introspection, but navigating difficult colleagues. And you also talked about influence, right? And oftentimes, I think we often fall into the trap, especially those of us who, as my mom would say, were raised properly, even as professionals. And something that I think I learned from you, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from you, right? Like, even if you don't respect the person, you respect the position. And so, for those
Mm-hmm.
of us with a high standard of excellence for ourselves, but also for the places we work, that ethos, causes you to, focus on the organization and the good of the organization, perhaps whether at the detriment or whether to the success of what is best for me or how I'm feeling in this moment. Because as you've often said, we don't choose the bosses. We have many times we
Mm-hmm.
don't get to choose the colleagues we have. And so having that underlying professional ethos about how I want to show up as a professional and being raised properly to respect my colleagues or at least the organization and the work that's at hand, that helps me then navigate moments when I don't feel as if the person in the position may be quote unquote worthy of my respect. So you touch on some
Mm-hmm.
key things there. I want to pivot our conversation. So we've talked a lot about introspection, looking inward. That is what Return to More is all about. However, there is room for others as well. So, if you're able to, can you share with us a time when you've had to navigate a difficult colleague or colleagues, plural, and sort of what was your journey like through that navigation?
I had a workplace where one member of the leadership team was showing up, definitively working very hard, but, and I say this with all intended feminism and respect, like could not work with a smile. And I don't need anyone to smile. That's not really what I mean. But like they couldn't show up to a meeting and act collegial. It was just clear in every message they sent, in every statement they made, in every time you ran into them, that they were just kind of annoyed to be there, and annoyed to be doing anything other than what they would have chosen to put on their calendar and have in their inbox that day.
Mm-hmm.
And their priorities were the priorities, and anything else came second to what like they woke up and they decided they were going to do. And it's hard because not only was I experiencing that friction as someone who worked alongside them and was trying to lead projects that required their participation or dedication of resources on their team or their expertise, so they can inherently hold anything up if you rely on their permission or expertise, and so you can't work around them. And then also the difficulty of just communicating with them. There was such a high barrier for wanting to even engage. You would do anything to avoid going through or to them
Mm.
because you knew they were going to make your day a little bit worse.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, I don't think this person in any way was trying to do a bad job. I think their definition of doing a good job looks very different from mine.
Wow. Can we put a
And
pause there for a sec?
yeah,
Like, what? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Continue, because that I
no,
think you said
please
something
do.
very powerful. What happens then when you butt up against someone, exactly as you said, their definition of doing a good job is completely different from yours?
Right. Well, and in this, right, and I'm not their manager, so I don't get to help define what their good job looks like,
Yeah.
right? So that's two different things. It's like that hierarchy issue, that de facto leadership, and that balance. In most of my roles throughout my career, I have held informal power. I very rarely had a stack of people in some organizational chart reporting up to me. I've much more frequently been a chief of staff, a policy advisor, someone who's potentially cabinet level in an organization, but I'm there because of the kind of ancillary expertise, the broad view, the stakeholder management that I can bring, not because someone needs the 20 people who work in my org flow to do something.
Mhm.
So I spent a lot of my time trying to navigate friction because anyone I would ask to do something, their first response, though, bless them, never said it out loud, is that you're not my boss, you're not my mom, you don't get to tell me what to do, right? Like, and that's a hard way to work in, but it also informs the way you show up, right? When every single project you lead in a job
Mhm.
kind of comes down to a favor,
Mhm.
right? The CEO might be asking for it. It might be a clearly stated aligned priority of the organization. No one doubts that. But your ability to force anyone to do it, which is a terrible word, is completely limited and potentially non-existent. So you have to
Yeah.
show up a certain way.
Yeah.
But that idea that you can both be showing up that day, having done your trying to be your best workplace self and trying to do your best work, and that you can be entirely at odds, is something that also doesn't also have to feel difficult. And I think part of the issue here, the word difficult is very specific, definitively negative,
Mhm.
right? But I don't think friction is definitively negative. And so you can be in a meeting disagreeing with someone who feels really passionately, and it doesn't have to feel bad. You can sense that you're both excited, that you both care a lot. And you might feel bad when you left the meeting because you didn't get what you wanted out of it.
Mhm.
But if the workplace is set up to support it and the relationships are there to undergird it, you actually feel like you're in a place where people who care. And that's a very positive thing to walk away from. When someone's definition of doing a good job means I did exactly what I had to do today, no more and no less,
Yeah.
that's really difficult for me. I was not raised that way.
Yeah.
My family owns a small business.
Yeah.
My dad only ever worked for himself or his father, so he doesn't have a lot of traditional workplace advice to offer me, and often gives me advice that would get me fired, with all the love in his heart. But he's like, why don't you just go in there and tell her blah 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 blah, and I'm like, that's not how any of this works. But that's a nice fantasy, right? Like, you would watch that scene happen in the movie, you'd say, oh my god, she's going to get fired, and then they'd be like, record scratch, that was just her daydream, that's not what she actually did in that meeting. Um, but my dad always told me to make myself indispensable. That's what he said.
Mm-hmm.
You go far if you can make yourself indispensable.
Yeah.
And I can actually attribute my career to that exact thing. And when you're trying to make yourself indispensable, that probably presumes you're going above and beyond, to do work. And I've worked in a lot of public agency environments with some brilliant and talented people. One
Mm-hmm.
of my favorites at the New York State Education Department, my colleague who was an admin assistant, an executive assistant, she had been there since she graduated high school. She
Wow.
was brilliant. There was no one at that organization she did not know. She held one job her whole life. She went up through the ranks. She got to the highest grade you can be. Um, and she was enormously talented and thoughtful and wonderful to work with. And she was like a walking dictionary of everything you can need to know about that place. And she worked hard and she went above and beyond. So when I say people who are, um, have a different view of civil service jobs, I don't mean that as a broad brush. I do mean that as an individual who sees good work as different from you. Um, and just to highlight that wonderful colleague, she didn't need to be trying to be the CEO when she grows up to do a great job every day. And I also
Mm-hmm.
think that's a misconception people have,
Yes.
that you aren't trying that hard because you're not trying to manage anybody. And like, that's okay. You can come to work. You can work to live instead of living to work, right? That's what we often say.
Yeah.
And they're paying me to be here. And the second they're not paying me, I don't have to be here. And I'm satisfied with what I did today. Um, I don't have that switch to turn, but I respect people who do. And you just have to motivate them and interact with them a little bit differently. Because if your meeting doesn't end at 5 and they're supposed to leave at 5, they will leave your meeting.
Yes.
And you can't begrudge them that.
Right.
Right? That's not, you don't get to judge them.
Yeah.
That's how they chose to show up to work today. Good for them for getting their work done before 5 p.m.
That is
I
true.
was not that successful that day.
Yeah.
I had more work to do.
Well, you mentioned something also, and you're just dropping so many nuggets and gems, which another reason I'm glad to have this conversation. But you were starting to get to systems. And I know that's a huge area of expertise, not just in the positions you've held, but the organizations you've worked in. But what are some indicators that a system is setting people up? Because you gave us quite a distinction between difficult and friction, right? And how the difficulty does have a negative connotation, but friction, while it can be negative, can also be an asset to move people together or work forward. And so, what are some indicators that a system is either well positioned or not well positioned to help navigate? I'll just continue using that word, navigate either friction or difficulty that may transpire among colleagues.
Yeah, I am a systems thinker without having been very intentional about that. I think that's how the world makes sense to me, to think about the interlocking parts, to think about the mousetrap of how if you do this over there, does the shoe kick over there, right? And thinking about things through a very specific lens of feasibility. I have a really hard time breaking outside the box in brainstorming. I know this about myself because if I know a legislature will never pass it, I know there'll never be funding for it, I know we'll never be able to hire the staff to do it, it's really hard for me to show up in that place fully open, because I can see too far down the line that it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge constraint for me, but that's, so I think about the systems and how they play with each other, but also what the constraints of that system would be, sometimes to my own detriment. But I think as for the markers of a system, I think there are routines that really matter. at the New York State Education Department, I was working for my awesome boss there. One of the first things she had me do was update this list of standing meetings. And it was a chart of all of the recurring meetings, what the standing agenda items were for that meeting, what the purpose of that meeting was, who's supposed to be in that meeting, who facilitates the meeting, who takes the notes, right? Just like basic information. And I remember being so annoyed. I was like, this is such a waste of my time. You've been doing these standing meetings for 2 years before I got here. Who is this helping? Who is this serving? Fast forward 5 years, I'm at my current organization, which is very rapidly growing and kind of in a building while flying it moment. Our budget was $500,000 6 years ago, and now it's almost $5 million.
Oh,
So
congratulations.
thanks. I think it's a lot, right? But it's exciting. But there's not a lot of structures, right? When you're just rapidly growing to meet these new demands and expectations and opportunities of the organization. And if I didn't start by making that meeting chart that I had hated so much 5 years ago, I was like, we need to know what these meetings are for, because one of my rules of thumb is if nobody prepared for the meeting, you shouldn't be having the meeting. Not everyone has to prepare. Sometimes you want your CEO there just to weigh in. They don't need a pre-brief. If you run the meeting right, you can have them in and out of an hour-long meeting in 15 minutes to get the decision points, right? You can be really respectful of people's time.
Yeah.
But if no one prepared for the meeting and you just sit down and you all look at each other and say, who's in charge here? And I think that sounds like a workplace joke to people. I was in a workplace where that happened once a week, where the supervisor of this diverse team would send a note being, we need to get started on X, right? We had some big annual events. It was a government affairs, public relations team. And so it's like, oh, well, legislative session's coming. We need to get prepared. Our fly-in day in DC is coming. We need to get prepared. And so someone would schedule the meeting, and then we'd show up in the meeting and we'd be like, well, who's in charge now?
Yes.
It would happen all of the time. And we eventually got there, but that first hour was a wash. That was a put your finger on your nose. If I don't talk, maybe I won't be in charge of this kind of meeting. And I'm not that person, but when there is that little direction about something, you don't really want to raise your hand right off the bat. And so silly things like standing meetings that can be short, right? I think we default to an hour a little too much, and maybe 20 minutes is enough for a weekly check-in. But standing meetings, knowing who's in that meeting and why they're there, and importantly, that person knows why they're there.
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of times you invite, and especially in an organization where there's a clear division maybe between program and finance, and you bring in someone from the finance team because you need their expertise, but you literally don't tell them anything about why you invited them, and they show up, and then you get 40 minutes through the meeting, ask them what they think, and they have no idea what they were supposed to have been listening for.
Right, right.
So it's like everyone knows why they're at the table, how they got there. And then when you're done with the meeting, everyone knows what they're leaving to do. And you have the next meeting set. Those kind of systems, which seems very basic, very like, Jessica, that's not that interesting. Anyone could have said that vibes.
No.
Sure. But it goes overlooked so often.
Yeah.
And if you have never sat down in a meeting room and had everyone look around and said, who's in charge? Or the most senior person just started talking because they assumed they should be in charge because someone has to talk.
Yes.
If you've never been in that scenario, like, bless you. I would love to know what sector you work in.
You and me both, or what organization you work for.
Right. But so I think those kind of, you get early signals from when someone orients you to a meeting. Jonathan, you welcoming me to that job we both worked at. If I had asked you, what do we do in cabinet meetings, and you couldn't articulate that, that would be a big sign to me that we don't have systems and functions that are working, that we're not collaborating effectively, right? It's people need to know what the meaning of purpose is. And that doesn't mean you can't ever have a free-flowing conversation or that everything needs to have a memo to get on the agenda, but you need to know what the purpose is and what you personally are supposed to be bringing to that meeting. And we had a lot of talks when we work together about who's the facilitator and how do we make sure that the person who's facilitating doesn't lose the chance to fully participate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If
Yeah.
you're in a cabinet meeting with your 6-person leadership team and one of those 6 has to run the meeting,
Yeah.
then they are disadvantaged from
Right.
participating in other ways because
Yes.
they're already taking up so much airtime
Yeah.
that it's hard for them to also participate because people are like, you've been talking for 20 minutes already.
Right.
So being really intentional about things like that can make a huge difference. And I think is also a very kind of low hanging fruit litmus test where you can see that as the foundation for a lot of different problems that, well, if we can't even know what a meeting is for, this person probably doesn't know what their work expectations are.
Yeah.
If we don't even know who we need in this meeting when we need to call in finance or we need to call in the provost office or whatever it is,
Yeah.
then we probably don't understand our organization and how it functions, right? There's like
Yeah.
a really clear sign through the lens of the calendar and the meeting protocols that tell you a lot about how people are or are not successfully collaborating.
So I'm going to make up a word, and I'm going to follow up with this question. Can an organization structures be over systemized? Meaning, so thank you for the kind compliment as we look back in history of me welcoming you into our organization. What would have happened if I didn't have that, to my own horn, if I didn't have that acumen, or if that foundation, or even just my professional knowledge alluding that I needed to do that and welcoming a new executive colleague to the organization? Can an organization be over systemized, meaning you have one person who is accustomed to doing everything? So you're speaking, so to set the context, if you're speaking about line level colleagues, so not in the hierarchy, but line level colleagues, head of the organization, you have one colleague who's accustomed to doing everything or many things or inserting themselves in people's work, not as necessarily in alignment with various collaboration styles, but just as a means of this is what I do or this is who I am, and so I'm doing it. How do you navigate that type of dynamic?
Well, once I had to go to my boss, so that workplace I just mentioned, I did actually once say to my boss, you please stop sending emails that have the vibe. It's like and she wasn't being a passive aggressive, wasn't being passive aggressive, but this is how I receive this kind of tone probably because it reminds me of sometimes the way my mother talks. And I love my mother, but no one loves when their mother is passive aggressive. Um, and she would send an email being like, I need someone to blah, 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 blah. And she would send it to 7 people. I need someone to. No, just send it to the one person and say, hey, do you
Yes.
have time to do this?
Yes.
Because you're pretending that you're, parsing out this work in some equitable way. It's definitely not meaningful if you say, I need someone to, and you don't say, hey, Jonathan, you have the skills and the acumen to do this, so I'm asking you to lead it, which sets you up in a different way. You feel good about it. You don't just feel like you had another burden coming on. In the scenario where we worked in together, I once asked our boss to stop saying that out loud. She didn't send emails, but she would say it out loud. I need someone to. And we had great colleagues, but you and I were the ones who raised our hands the most because we just wanted the weird teacher wait time tension to be done. I need someone to. Well, I'll do it if we can move on from this conversation.
Yes.
Right? And so like those are things that like get back to like the lack of system, but at the same time the over systematized came up a lot, especially in my transition from New York to Nevada. So I worked in New York public agencies, I worked for the governor's office, I worked in higher ed, I worked at the state education department, as I mentioned. And New York, as you can imagine, just has a huge government apparatus. It's a very old government, it's a very large government, it's very professionalized, and there's, tens and tens of thousands of state workers all across the state,
Yeah.
mostly in Albany. And I was used to systems. I was used to roadblocks. I was used to there being a law, a regulation, a rule, a file, a worksheet, a permission slip, a fax number for everything. You want to do that? Here's your list from A to B, A to Z of how to do that. You want to do that? Call Kathy. Kathy calls Jim. Whatever.
Yeah.
It was kind of about learning which buttons to push. But there was like clear information people could give you about how to navigate. No one ever said like, good luck figuring that out. People could say, oh, well, it usually works this way. I think in New York, I saw a lot of formalized systems that existed for a long time, and that whether they were effective or not, people were used to navigating them. And that can have a lot of value if people just know what to expect. And I think when I moved to Nevada, it's a much younger government, it's a much smaller state apparatus,
Yeah.
and there are a lot fewer people at play.
Mm-hmm.
There's fewer resources, and there's fewer roadblocks to starting something new.
Mm-hmm.
However, because of our part-time legislature and all these other aspects, our very small executive governor's team, the processes that we had were exhaustive.
Mm-hmm.
Were like long and drawn out. And if
Yes.
you want to get a contract in front of the committee that oversees contracts, which by the way requires scheduling the governor, secretary and state and attorney general to be in the same room at the same
Of the
time.
entire state.
Of the entire state. Tell me another state where the governor would sit down once a month and look at contracts on a live stream.
And vote.
On a live stream, Jonathan, and vote on a live stream. I know you did it too, but it was crazy to me. I always said, can you show me Gavin Newsom sitting down on a live stream to review budgets? I would fall out of my chair. Anyway, all that is to say that Nevada, they'd be like, you want to get a contract done, you need to start 9 months before you hope it's approved.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Right? And so there become these systems that have so many steps and so many touch points. And because Nevada is a smaller state and a very relational state,
Yes, it is.
where because of the nature of the term limitations, the short legislative sessions, the staff end up with so much more expertise and capacity than the elected officials themselves. The staff are kind of running things.
Yeah.
They're telling people what to do, what the problems are, and how to fix them. And when you have all these tweaks in a process over time, it actually just gets longer and worse. Yeah. And I feel like I showed up in Nevada and I was introduced to a whole lot of long and bad processes that weren't serving people.
Yeah.
And I tried to create some internal processes that I thought would be important for coordination and communication in our agency. And I could tell that people were really put off by an attempt to like systematize things that felt very personal to them. I don't need a form for that. I just go down and I ask Laura and she tells me what to do. I don't need a form. I don't need to ask permission. I can do this myself.
What happened when Laura's on leave or, God forbid, just not in the office at that exact moment you need her?
Gets a new job. Or how about when Laura gets a new job and you have no proof of how she ever did her job because there was never a form or a spreadsheet that tracked it, and there's no succession planning because state agencies do not allow you usually to have overlapping people cross-train.
Yeah.
And also don't have time to succession plan, which I don't need to tell you. So like that whole idea that I was like, okay, if we just had some systems, I think it was a combination of like every system that was active in Nevada was somehow overburdened and under-resourced. So people were already like, processes don't work for me here. Why would I want a new process?
Yeah.
But also people have a very personal, in the like warmest possible way, personal way of working in Nevada where they really want to know you as a human before they like respect you as a professional, which is, I think, the opposite of New York.
Yeah.
If you work hard enough and well enough, then maybe 6 months in, someone will offer to take you for lunch because they suddenly decided you were important enough to them as a person. Nevada's the opposite. Take me to lunch and then maybe I will do the task you assign me.
Yes.
It's really hard to put in systems in that environment where they see systems as a direct threat to their ability to relate to one another the way they think they ought to or should be allowed to. They see it. I remember I spoke to you about this all the time, Jonathan. I grew up in a very political, with like small P but big P. Like I wasn't working for part, but like you work for a governor, it's a pretty political job.
Yeah.
The highest compliment to anyone would be the governor talking about your work on a stage or in a press release, right? that what you did was important enough to be mentioned in the State of the State address, to be a part of a cabinet meeting, right? You'd be really proud of that. In Nevada, when we told people that actually the superintendent and the deputy superintendents were going to be the only people to testify to the legislature because we thought that was appropriate, people got offended.
Yeah.
They said, I'm the expert. How dare you take credit for my work? And it's like, do people work in state government to get credit? There are a lot of jobs that allow you to go get credit. State government is not really what it's known for.
Yeah.
And people felt very put off by that. So there were a lot of these nuances to the pride people took in their work, the way they saw themselves in their job, what they thought their job was, that were being very threatened by any attempt to say, here's the system, here's how we're going to do this now.
Yeah.
It was very strange to me. You can hear it in my voice. I still really can't wrap my arms around it.
Well,
and I did it for 3 years.
Tried to automate systems that just really threw people over the edge. Imagine implementing systems that required people to interact automatically. Yeah, fascinating.
Because they were losing control, and they thought their job, and Jonathan, they thought their job was control.
Yeah.
And that is a problem.
Yeah.
Is your job to enable or to control? Is your job to move things through or stop them? What is the lens you take to your work?
Which I think we don't have time to get into it now, but I think a conversation about how people view their work in the context of an organization. So what is my place in my work in the context of an organization? I think where you and I are aligned is we know our primary motivation or our primary goal is to support the executive and support of the organization. And so there's a lot of not only introspection, a lot of sacrifice that comes with that. But there is a lot of, I would say, skill. Everyone doesn't have the skill, which is why everyone hasn't been successful as you, or dare I say me, once upon a time. But I think the fundamental question is that, like, what is my place in the organization and how does it contribute to the work moving forward? And when you get clear about that, I think so much of what you named, whether it's about engaging with people, engaging with systems, it allows you to navigate them in a way that, once again, helps you maintain professionalism, helps you not get fired, but also helps you to move work forward. So in the few minutes we have left, I'm so enjoying our conversation. And I know our listeners are as well. Do you have any key takeaways? Or is there anything that I haven't brought up? You and I have obviously had similar conversations hundreds of times, but is there anything that I haven't brought up that you want the listeners to walk away with when we think of this particular episode, Workplace Chronicles, Navigating Difficult Colleagues? We've talked about introspection, so self. We've talked about systems. We've talked about our approach to others. Anything else for the listener?
I think it's really important to have safe touch points. I deeply believe there's no such place as a safe, no such thing. Sorry. I deeply believe there is no such thing as a safe place in a professional environment. The safe place implies no matter what you say or do, that there are no consequences because we're willing to talk it out. And so when I say safe, I don't mean like boundaryless, psychologically, safe place. But you need a person or people that you can talk to, that you can tease things out with, whether that's because they can help you identify where there's going to be resistance. Oh, remember last time someone said something like that when Sissy was in the room and she really didn't like that word. Let's think about this differently. Right, like a sounding board. You also need to find someone you can vent to. We have been that person for each other. But something one of our shared colleagues, whom we both adore, Felicia, once said to me is you cannot complain down.
Ooh.
You cannot
say more.
Go to your direct reports and say, I'm having a terrible day. Can you believe this happened to me? That's not your job as a leader.
Yeah.
As I said earlier, I do believe you can express vulnerability to encourage them to do the same, to enable you both to move forward.
Yeah.
But when your direct report is meeting with you, it's their time. They're not there to therapize you. They might be there to manage you up, depending on your leadership style, but they're not, unless you're the executive and they're your chief of staff, like that's not the job. And so, and I was navigating this. I was the interim president of Nash for about a year. And I could not believe, after working at the right hand of so many executives, quite how different being in that role felt. And it does feel very different, because if you hold yourself to these standards that I don't complain down, who are you complaining to? Because
Right.
when you're a deputy superintendent, there are 2, 3, 4 people on your line
Yeah.
that you can rely on. When you're the CEO, there's no one.
Wow.
And so it kind of changes your whole perspective of who your audience, who your circle, who your support system ought to be. But I think what I'm trying to take away is that you need one. I also think it's really important to understand yourself and where you're coming from, and be able to start at the beginning of the story to bring people along. I can very quickly assess a political environment. I had to, as
Yeah.
second nature in many of my jobs. I spend a lot of time, and I think the right amount of time, on giving people the why. Why are we doing this? Why is it important that it's done this way? If I do feel it's important, it's done a certain way. And I will literally say to people explicitly, I do not care if you change this, or I will care if you change this.
Yeah. And I
I will
think that,
say, when I onboard people to a new job, that process just got pens down. I am so sorry if it doesn't work for you. I want to hear about it, but I cannot promise we can do anything about it,
yeah.
because we have barely, touched it. It just got confirmed. But I also like asking the opposite question. We had a big problem, you'll remember, that people were not updating their org charts. And we needed org charts where we worked together all the time. We needed them for budget requests. It just
Yeah.
came up constantly in a way I've never seen before or since. And people weren't updating their org charts. And so people were like, Jessica, we need a new policy. You're the person who comes up with new systems, right? You're going to fix the org chart problem. And I said, well, what's the current expectation? And they said, oh, when you send in the request form to get the tech setup done for your new employee, you're supposed to send in the new org chart. I said, okay, what happens if they don't send in the org chart? They said, well, we do it anyway. I said, so you're not using your
Right.
own process? And like, well, people get really mad if their staff don't have a computer on the first day. And so it's not worth it. I said, it would be worth it to do it once. Our agency was very small, was
Right.
less than 200 people.
Yeah.
You one time put your foot down on the org chart and say, sorry, your employee doesn't have email today. Not sorry, you didn't follow the process.
Yeah.
Better bet they would have handed in the org chart the next time.
Right. Right.
And so really thinking before you decide to change things, is the person being difficult? Is the process being difficult? Is the person being difficult because they're sick of being asked the same question, promised solutions, and not getting them? You can hold a staff feedback session every month, right? It wasn't a staff feedback session, but we did have a monthly kind of all staff meeting.
Yeah.
You can create space where people can share their concerns and ideas, but if nothing ever comes of it, all you've done is demonstrated in action and given people something to get frustrated about. And so you have to be really intentional when you're creating processes, when you're creating spaces, when you're seeking feedback, that you really mean it. Because I don't know if I would call it my number one, but I say it a lot. My number one professional rule is, don't ask a question you don't want the
Right.
answer to.
Absolutely. Or you're not prepared to do something about.
Right.
Yeah.
Of anyone. Don't say, honey, does my dress look good? Like, yeah, sure. Hopefully you've trained your honey to say you look great, but like, don't ask a question you don't want the answer to. Um, and I think that works in every direction in the workplace, in every environment, for every type of person. If you don't want to know that the process is going bad because you're not willing to change it, then please do not send out a survey on the process.
Absolutely. And with that, I would just say to the listener, Jessica has certainly, listeners, given us more to carry with you. I think for me, a couple of the key takeaways when we think about how to navigate difficult colleagues. One, it starts with introspection. Jessica certainly shared some nuggets around how we can connect with ourselves and in a way return to more to get clear about who we are and who we are in position to the places that we work. She also shared a lot about systems. So when we think about difficult colleagues, is it the person? Or is it the system that creates the atmosphere for the person to be perceived as difficult? So she walked us through several examples of where systems both promoted difficulty, but where they also help difficulty dissipate. And then I think the third thing that I'm taking away from the conversation is Jessica mentioned getting clear on who you are as a professional, why you're there at your organization, why you're doing the work that you're doing, and what do you want your contribution to be. And I think out of the many nuggets, those are the three top ones that I will certainly be carrying with me. And so I hope there are more to carry with you. We now enter the segment where I share a little anecdote or something funny. And so I'm going to invite Jessica, because we are friends, to engage in this one with me. I typically share something about myself, but this one, what has really been grinding my gears. Jessica, do you watch Shark Tank?
I haven't watched it recently, but I watched it plenty.
Okay, so you know what really grinds my gears about Shark Tank? I think it's a great show, great premise. I have ordered from some of the entrepreneurs on the show, one who had a cake mix that was good, and I forget which others. But, they sit there and sometimes they're so disrespectful to the contestants where they're like, I really believe in your vision. I really believe in your product. And that's why I want to work with you. And these are often ones who are most desperate for help. And they'll be like, okay, I'm going to give you $10,000, but I want 95% of your company. And you have like 30 seconds to say yes. And I'm like, I don't know, it just grinds my gears. Granted, it's an extreme example, but we certainly have seen them numerous times where they just like offer change for a commanding portion of someone's business. Mm-hmm. So just grinds my gears. But with that, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Return to More. You can watch this episode and many others on my website at returntomore.com. If this episode has helped you in any way, I ask that you not only subscribe to it, but that you share it with someone you care about. Because at some point, we're all going to have to navigate difficult people, whether colleagues, relationships, etc. And until that time, until you return to more, be well. Thanks.